And welcome back to Backspace Academy. In this practical lab, we'll introduce you to the AWS database services, and we'll look at doing a hands-on exercise with one of those services, being the Amazon Relational Database Service, or RDS for short. We will be creating a MySQL database server instance, and then we're going to connect from our desktop through to that instance and have a look at a database that we created on that instance. And then we'll finish up by terminating that instance to make sure that we don't get a bill at the end of the month. So the database options that are available for us, the first one there being RDS, or a relational database, and that is AWS's SQL database engines that are available on a platform as a service. So what that means is that you might have a MySQL database, and AWS will look after all the low-level stuff for you. They'll look after patching of the operating system. They'll look up at updating patches for the database and that sort of thing. And you really just need to look after the high-level administration of your database. The database engines that are available to launch on RDS include MySQL and a number of variations of that. So we have the MySQL Community Edition, which is available on the free tier. We also have MariaDB, and we have Amazon Aurora. Now, Amazon Aurora is AWS's enterprise scale equivalent of the MySQL database, and it is not available on the free tier. We also have PostgreSQL, and we also have Oracle and Microsoft SQL Server database engines available to launch on RDS. The NoSQL option available there is DynamoDB, which is a serverless environment. So it goes one step ahead of, or one step above from RDS, in that you don't have to worry about anything to do with the database. You just create a table and AWS will look after everything else for you. And that is a very good solution for high-speed databases, in particular for NoSQL databases. Elasticache, and that is in-memory caching for databases. And what that does, it allows very high speed, very low latency access to data. And what it does, it will cache in memory frequently accessed data from your database. And when a requester wants that data, it will be delivered from in memory back to the requester with very low latency. And that is something to consider if you are looking at providing a large database that has a lot of regularly accessed data, and you need to have very good performance out of that. And it also allows you to reduce costs and the overhead on your back-end database. Amazon Redshift, now that is the data warehousing solution for AWS. And what that is, it is a PostgreSQL database engine that has been modified for use on AWS and modified to provide high performance with petabyte scale data. The AWS migration service, and that orchestrates and helps to streamline the migration of data from one database to another. That could be from on-premises to AWS, or it could be within AWS as well. But it helps to streamline and helps to orchestrate that migration of data. Okay, so let's have a look at how we would use these database services in an example. So over on the right-hand side there, we've got our corporate data center in blue with an on-site database. On the left-hand side, we've got the AWS cloud in orange. Inside the AWS cloud, we've got a VPC. And again, that VPC is our own private space within the AWS cloud. Now, if we wanted to migrate our database from our corporate data center to Amazon RDS, then the first thing we would do is we would launch an RDS instance inside of our VPC. And so here we can see we've got an RDS Oracle instance. And once we've got that up and running, we can then look at creating, using the database migration service, a workflow or a job that will orchestrate the migration of that data from our on-site database through to our RDS instance. Once our RDS instance is up and running, we can start look at increasing the performance of that. So for example, just say that we were getting a whole heap of requests coming in all at once. How would we manage that? So we don't want to have any sort of complicated architecture that's going to be able to auto scale or whatever. That's not going to be available for us using the RDS service. So the best way to manage these spikes in demand, especially when there's spikes in demand from regularly accessed data, is to use Elasticache. And Elasticache will get frequently accessed data from the RDS instance, and it will store it in its cache. And so then those requests that come into the RDS instance, they will come into the RDS cache. If those requests, or if the information required is located inside the cache, it will just be sent back. If it's not, then that request will be forwarded on to that RDS instance. And that greatly reduces the load on our RDS database or our RDS server. And it provides really high speed, low latency access to our data for our users. So let's go and have a look at how we can use the RDS server. So we're just going to, inside of our default VPC, we're going to launch a MySQL database instance using the RDS service. Then we're going to do that using the AWS Management Console. And then we're going to connect into that MySQL instance using the MySQL Workbench application. And then once we're finished with everything, we're going to tear it all down and make sure that we don't get a bill at the end of the month. Okay, so I'm in the AWS Management Console now. We go to Services, to the Database Services and RDS. Now that will take us into the RDS dashboard, but if we don't have any RDS instances created previously, then it will go into a welcome screen like this. So we're just going to go to the left-hand side here, click on Instances, and we're going to launch a DB instance. Now we have a number of options available for our database engine. We have Amazon Aurora, which, as we said previously, is AWS's MySQL Enterprise Class database. And that is not eligible on the free tier, so we're not going to use that for now. And we have the MySQL Community Edition, and again they've got the Amazon Aurora. In case you missed it previously, they've put it up there, but we're not going to use it because it costs us money. MariaDB, again, is a MySQL compatible database. And again, if you missed it, there we have Amazon Aurora as well, which we won't be selecting. PostgreSQL, Oracle, and Microsoft SQL Server. So to make sure that we don't get a bill at the end of the month, we're going to click on this checkbox here saying free tier eligible only. And there we can see Amazon Aurora is not eligible for the free tier. So we go into MySQL and we can see Amazon Aurora there is grayed out again. We can't select it, and we're going to select the MySQL Community Edition. And again, we make sure that we have this option here available. It says only show options that are eligible for the RDS free tier. We don't want to get a big bill at the end of the month. Now, if we scroll down, we have a number of options here. So the only one that we really need to be concerned with is the instance class. So we're going to use a DBT2 micro, which is a pretty small instance, and it's on the free tier. We don't have any other options for storage type other than SSD, where we're working on the free tier. So we leave everything there as it is. Now we go into the settings of our database server. So our database server needs to have a DB instance identifier. It needs to have a name. So I'm just going to call this one \intro-AWS. Now that needs to be unique within your AWS account for DB instances. Next, we're going to create a user, and I'm just going to call the master user admin, and I'll give that master user a password. Now that password has to be at least 8 characters long. So once we've completed that, we've put in our name of our database, we've put in our username for the master user of this database or this database server, and we've put in our master password and we've confirmed that password, we click on Next Step. Now, we don't need to configure any of these advanced settings for network and security. We just leave the default settings as they are, but as we get more into RDS and other services later on in the course, we'll be getting more involved in this sort of stuff. But for now, we just want to just get our dip our toes in the water or so with AWS. Now, we have an option to create a database on launch with this database server. So we're just going to create a database called test. If we leave it blank, then there will be no databases on this database server, and we can create those later on. But we'll just have one ready to go, and we'll call it test. Now, we don't need to worry about backups because this is just a lab. We're going to be doing it on the free tier. We just don't want to have any hassle with that. So I'm just going to change the backup retention period to 0, and that will mean that it will disable automated backups for the instance. We don't need to worry about monitoring or maintenance. We just leave that as it is. Again, this is just a hands-on introduction to RDS. And then we can launch that DB instance. After a certain amount of time, that will be acknowledged and we can view our DB instances. And we can see there that it has a status of creating, and after a while it will go to being available for use. Okay, so after a few minutes, or quite a few minutes, we've got our MySQL database server on RDS up and running, and its status is available. So the thing that we need to understand here is that we can now connect through to this RDS instance through an endpoint, and that endpoint is here. So we need to take note of that, and the part that we're interested in is the endpoint domain. So everything there finishing with amazonaws.com, and we don't do the :3306. We just select that. So I'm just going to select that now because we're going to be using that later on. Now, before we do that, we need some software to connect into our MySQL instance. So we need to go to the MySQL homepage, and there is a link in the lab notes to this to download the MySQL workbench and install it to our system. Okay, so here I am in the MySQL workbench, and down the bottom there we can see that we have the MySQL connections, and we don't have any as yet, so we just click on the plus sign next to it and we'll add our connection to our RDS instance. So we just give that a name. So I'm just going to call it backspace, that will be fine. Now a host name is going to be that connection string that we got, or that domain that we got from our RDS console, and it's not going to have the :3306 on the end of it. It's just going to have the domain details, the host name details, and the 3306 is our port number, which is already detailed there on the screen. Now our username is going to be that master user that we set up when we created our RDS instance, and I used admin. And that is all we need. We just need a user, we need a host name, and we need the port that we're connecting on. So if we just test that connection now, it will ask for a password. And we've successfully made that MySQL connection. So we just click on OK, and we can add that to there. So once we've created that connection, we can obviously connect into our database. So all we need to do is double click on that. And there we've connected into our RDS database, and we've got our MySQL or our SQL dashboard there set up. Now, if we look down here under schemas, we can see that we have that test database that we created, or that we requested to be created in our launch configure, or when we're doing our configuration for our launch details of this RDS instance. So if we click on that information icon next to test, that will give us some information on that. Okay, and there we can see we've got our backspace database with a test schema in there. So our server backspace and our test database inside there. So there we have it. We've successfully created an RDS instance and we've connected into it using MySQL Workbench, which was pretty great. Now that you've successfully connected in using the MySQL Workbench, I'm going to show you how to connect in with the MySQL shell software, and that will allow you to do command line work, such as issuing SQL commands to your RDS instance. So the first thing we need to do is to install or download the MySQL shell, and there is a link in the lab notes to that URL to do that. Now when you get there, just scroll down, select your operating system. If you're on Windows, don't do this installer for Windows. It will install MySQL and all this stuff you don't really need. All we need is this 16.5 meg file down the bottom here. So just download that. If you're on a Mac, it will look something like this. So you will have a DMG archive that you can download and extract after you've downloaded. Okay, so now that we're in the MySQL shell, we can connect into our RDS instance. So the way that we do that is we do backslash, not forward slash, backslash, connect, and then we do our username, which was admin, and then we do @ and then we do that endpoint, our RDS endpoint. So we just jump back into the RDS console, we'll select that endpoint and copy it and bring it over. Now we don't have to worry about removing the :3306, we can leave it there, or we can take it off and it will default to 3306 anyway. We enter our password that we created, and that should connect us in a short amount of time. And there we go. Now what I'd like to do is just issue some SQL commands to the database. So I need to change to SQL mode. So again, we do \SQL, and I can issue a command now. So show databases. Now make sure that you put a semicolon on the end of your SQL commands, otherwise they're just going to hang there. And then we can see we've got our standard MySQL databases there, and down the bottom we've got our test database that was created for us by the RDS service. Now the test database will be empty, so I'm just going to select one of the system databases there, so the MySQL one will be fine. So I just do use, and then that schema or that database that I'm going to use, so MySQL will be the one that I use. And there we go, schema is set to MySQL. Now, when you do that command, make sure that you don't put the semicolon on the end of it, otherwise it'll hang again. Now, I just want to issue another SQL command again, so we can show schemas this time. Well, actually, no, we'll show tables, actually. And that will list the tables for the MySQL database. And there you go. So there's all those standard tables that you would have in there. So we've managed to connect in using the command line interface, or the shell, MySQL shell, and we've switched over to the SQL mode and we've run SQL commands. So what we're going to do now is we're going to jump back into the AWS RDS console, and we're going to delete all this to make sure that we don't get a bill at the end of the month. And back in the RDS console, we go to, or first of all, we select our MySQL instance. We go to Instance Actions, and then we go to Delete. We don't want to create a final snapshot, and then we click the acknowledgement that we won't be able to get this back after we've deleted, and we click on Delete. And that will be deleting, and eventually it will disappear from the screen if we keep refreshing the screen here. So there we have it. We've created that instance and we've connected in, and now we're cleaning it all up afterwards. So I look forward to seeing you in the next lab.